All right, so next up, just a simple one true false answer is not particularly interesting or that useful, except for as the beginning, start off here. So the very next thing is to create a true false class. And what that's going to do is that's going to enable us to create an array. And inside of this array, so we go to new class. And it is named true false, and it inherits from Java lang.object, true false, as does everything inside of Java. Everything is a inheritor of the java.lang.object package when you create a new class. And so we will also have the inherit abstract methods. That's fine. We can also tell it to add comments if we so desired, but we will not be doing that. So then we click finish. And that just gets us up and tells us that our package is everything inside of this .NET brwebdesign.geoquiz or whatever you've named your particular package class. And then what we're going to do is add these private variables right inside of here. And why are they private? Well, there is a principle of programming best practices, and basically it states that a correct class should be easy to extend but difficult to modify. And so by having our variables private, we cannot access them outside the scope of a particular class. But by having our methods either being public, protected, or protected, we can create a class that extends our superclass, and that subclass will then be able to add new features to it without having to modify the original code. So in general, most variables tend to be private, so that way they cannot be accessed outside of their scope. Okay, and then it's telling you the reason why in question is of type integer. So you can see here we have one that is a Boolean and the other one that's of type integer, and that is because it will be referencing a resource ID rather than a static string. Then it tells you that you can tell it to generate getters and setters, and it's telling you that Eclipse by default does not do that, or at least this M for member variables. And so in order to do that, we're going to go to Windows Preferences, Window Preferences. Then we're going to go to Java and Code Style. And then from there, we're going to set M for the fields. And that's enough. And then S for the static. And then hit apply. And it's telling you the reason we're doing this because we can create automatic getters and setters. And the way you get that done inside of Eclipse is you right click, you go to source, and you have this generate getters and setters, and then you can select what you want it to generate getters and setters for, and then it sets them up. And let's see if it wants those to be public, and it does. So use set question. Interesting. I'm just looking at it because generally whenever you have a setter, you make it protected. And the reason you do that is that way you cannot directly manipulate a question from outside of its scope. Alright, and so then we're going to be creating an array of true-false objects. It will interact with the text view and it will display the questions. Then it goes into the MVC pattern, and MVC is basically, it came from a dissertation paper that said the correct way to structure code is to have a separation of concerns, and you should have first up the model, which basically holds logic or how to actually do something. Then you have the controller, which is called when an action is performed, and it directs resources to the model. So basically, your model has a logic like, create a new question. The controller says when it should call that particular method. And then finally, you have a view, and that just displays output. So you have the separation of concerns where the controller is interact with the model and with the view, so that if you ever have to update anything in the model, the view should be completely unaware of that change. The view should be completely separate from that change, as should the controller, so that you can change things without breaking your app repeatedly. If instead you do not have a separation of concerns, then any change you make will have to be updated in multiple places, and it is very easy to create fragile and brittle code that breaks often if you don't separate your concerns. And here's our little thing, blah, blah, blah. So then it says that we're going to remove some hard-coded strings, and we're going to be adding some new stuff in there. Okay, and if I read this correctly, then what it's telling me to do is that inside of my text view, I had said that you can add an ID to that earlier in the previous lesson, and that is exactly what it's doing, which means we can now programmatically manipulate what question is called, and then we also create a button which is of type next button, and inside of here, we assign it an ID, and we assign it a string resource of next button, and of course I'm getting my errors right now. There is basically telling me that there is no such thing that matches the particular string which I have told it to find. Next up, whenever I go back into, okay, so this is actually showing you those changes rather than just the layout visual view that it gave you just a second ago. So now it wants me to go into my string resources, and it wants me to create this string right here, which is the string type next, and it's telling me to remove the string with the hard-coded question value right there. So it wants that to be gone, and it wants that to be in its place. And hopefully, string next button, if I did that right. Okay, I'm still missing this one. I don't actually have a question text. But if I did that correctly, that should be fine. And now it wants me to add in these strings right here to the list as well. And I'm going to go ahead and collapse certain things so it's easier to read. And indent it like so. And again right here. And then it says that I'm going to need to add an array. Of type true false, and create some more private buttons. That's inside this true false class right here. And it looks like it actually removes something, so I'm going to go ahead and add it back in here. No. as I was. It actually was going to add this to the main activity, which it calls quiz activity. Now, what I could do to make this easier on myself is I could right click, I could choose refactor, and I could tell it to rename it and then update the references. And I'll go ahead and do that just for simplicity's sake. I'll call this quiz activity. And then it shows me everywhere where I need to make that change in order for it to follow through. And I'll go ahead and do that. And I'll add in those lines. And I think that you shouldn't have a comma at the end of a array list like this. So what this says to do is to create an array of true-false objects and set them to the name. The name of this variable is mQuestionBank, and it is a new true-false array. And then each new true-false has the following resource IDs of question oceans, and then what the actual correct answer is to that. And make sure everything's saved here. Now in my onCreate method, after set content view, I'm going to then create this new question text view, and strings. No, there is no question text, so that is still incorrect. And so the next thing that I have to do, I'm going to expand this just so it's easier to see everything on one line, and then I'm going to be creating this new event listener, which is this mNext button equals button, and I'm just going to copy and paste it on in, just that way I'm free of errors. And then I'm going to indent it, so that way it is easier to understand what belongs where. And you can see that in the actual source code, they did indent it. So there we go. And then as I did before, I'm going to select it. I'm going to right click it. I'm going to go to refactor, and I'm going to extract this method as next button click. And again, that's just because now instead of having a huge block of code, I can simply hold down Control and open up this decoration and jump right down into it. The next thing I'm going to need to do is to create a private method. And they created this private method actually before the onCreate, so okay, put that guy right there. And then it's going to have me remove some of these things that I created on the onCreate, which I guess they put it here just because now it's easier to read inside of the question section. But onCreate there, I have my mNext button question update. And now instead of doing it right here, hit Control Space, that'll give you the automatic code completion. And so now I'm calling it from within here on this update question, which basically what it did was it did the same thing I did with my refactorings, where it moved this code, instead of it being inline, it placed it inside of its own dedicated private method. Now normally I would put this next to there so it's easier to understand what's happening before it's called. But I think the book did this just that way it's immediately clear where things begin and end. So let's go back here and see if there are any errors, and it looks like that fixed most of them, except for of course my still existing style warnings. I'm going to go ahead and delete this code because I've already successfully refactored it so that I don't have so much inline code being called and used. So now if I go to activity main.xml, I'll switch back to my graphical layout. I will expand this by double clicking on it, and I will run it as an Android app. And again, it's going to take a while to load it up. Okay, so here it is, and what should happen is that when I click next, well, nothing's happening, but I do see that the other pieces are working correctly. Okay, and what happened there was that I missed a very important piece of code out of my project, and that was this mCurrent index. So it's hard coded to the value of 0 to start off with, which makes sense. We want to start off at the first index of the array, and all arrays in Java are indexed starting from 0. But then what we need to do is we need to get the current index and add 1 to it, and then return the modulus of the total questions. And basically the modulus just means that the remainder whenever you do a division. So now the next button is running. So the next thing to do is to make this check answer inside of the quiz activity. So scroll it on down, and it put this one after update question, which is right here. And what this does, it checks the answer to see with a Boolean value, which is passed in there. It checks to see if the answer is actually true. And if it is, it gives us the correct message, else it gives us the false message, and then it uses this as the context, which is, I'm actually not sure how Java handles the this constructor. I'm assuming that it means this is the object that it called it from, which should be quiz activity. We then set the message resource ID, which is this r.string, whichever one of these is passed in there, and then we set the toast length to short. And now if I run this again, which should go fairly quick because the Haxum emulator is up and running. And apparently I'm not very good. Looks like all these answers are false. I might have a bug, perhaps? It's looking like I have a bug. Because this is definitely true. Okay, so I have a bug, so hold on. And my bug is right here, and that is that I've had it hard-coded right now on the onTrue button. Previously, there was only one answer. So this toast.makeAnswer always had it when you clicked true. It would be incorrect. So now we're going to check the answer. We're going to pass it the value of true to it. And if it's correct, they get the correct toast, else they get the incorrect toast. So now whenever I go back down here, I'm going to pass that exact same check down here. And that is check answer false. So now it's actually going to pass that Boolean value in and see whether the answer was true or false. And that should give me the correct behavior that I'm looking for down here. So true, and this is a false answer, so okay. Of course, now I've got so many. So now there we go. So now it actually knows there's between true and false. Or did I just reverse the problem? Okay, so that wasn't actually an error. It's just starting off with the questions of the middies, which is set to false, and I know that because when I look at the actual string here, so it connects the red C, it says that should be false. And if I say next, the next question is blah, blah, blah. Question Africa, source the Nile River, yep. And then when I look here, this should also be false. Okay. Next up, I have the question the America, which should be true. It is. And then I get to Lake Baki, which should also be true. And then finally, when I click the final next, it wraps back around and takes me to the final true-false question, which should be true. So my assumption there that was mistaken was that on the initial call, it updates the question, which means it automatically adds 1 to the current index. And because it does that, it doesn't start off right here. It actually starts off right here, and then it just keeps looping through. And that's what this little modulus is being done to, is it says the current index should be 1 plus the remainder of whatever that is. So that way it wraps around whenever it's finished. So that wasn't an error. That was actually just me not quite understanding what goes on in this. So let's actually dig into the code a little bit. Simply, the buttons aren't particularly confusing, nor is the text view. But the first thing that we do is we create an array of these question banks, array of these true-false objects, and we set it to the variable name question bank, and then we say we want a new array of true-falses, and when we look at our true-false class, whenever it is called, this is its constructor here, and you can either create a blank constructor, which is a constructor that takes no arguments, or you can not actually have one at all. But in this case, we're saying our constructor must have two things. The first one must be an integer type, and that's the question, and then the boolean of what that is. And then we set the variable mQuestion to whatever that question is, and we set the variable mTrueQuestion to whatever boolean gets passed into there. So then next up, and let me close up these XML files because they're not necessary. We then tell it that the integer we want is the ID to the string, question Pacific Oceans, and it grabs that string resource for us, which is actually of type integer, and that's again because of these r.config files. If we look for ocean, we see that what's actually grabbing is that. So it's not set to string, it's set to integer, and then we pass in the boolean value true and false and so forth for each of these different questions. Then we set the current index equal to 0. Then we say that when the question is updated, the current index is equal to whatever the current index is by the modulus of however many questions are left over, which is the remainder of how many questions are left over. And then our next question is we call the question bank with whatever the current index is. And then we call its getQuestion method, which whenever we look at the getQuestion, it returns whatever the resource string is that gets passed in there. So the integer that refers to the ID, that refers to the actual string, gets returned back to the Java class. And then the next thing we do is we grab the text view and we set the text of that particular text view to the question. Then we have the check answer, and what that does is it is a boolean of whether or not they passed in true or false, and then we check whatever we check the answer actually of is this a true question, and when we look at that, it returns whether or not it's true or false. It then compares that to whatever the person pressed, and if they match up, then we get the correct toast. If they don't match up, then we get the incorrect toast. And then we make a toast which passes in this, and then the message resource ID, and then the toast length, and then the .show method, so it'll actually show the toast. And then our onCreate, we just call to a resource of whatever the question text view is. And when I look at that, it's right here. So that grabs that particular object, it typecasts it to a text view. We then typecast two buttons, and then we call the methods we've created. So if they click the true button, we check the answer, And whenever they check the answer, we pass in whatever they pressed. And again, this is the same thing we just covered. The false button does the exact same thing, except for the argument we pass in is now false. So whenever we go back up here, if they press false, that gets passed in there. When they click the next button, we find where that next button is, and then we create a new event. And that new event just calls update question, which just looks for where we're at, does the modulus, and sets the next question up. And then finally, the first time this is run, and this is where I was having issues, or what I didn't quite understand, and I actually had this located in a different place. But the first time, and the first time only that this is called, it will automatically add 1. It will automatically update the answer. And it has to do that because otherwise, if we have not actually called update question, then there is no integer of type question that has been set up by default. We could do that if we wanted to, but if we do not have an initial call to update question, then the actual value of the set text object of the text view is going to be null because there isn't going to be anything that has already been passed in yet. So we set up a default question in order to fix that particular problem. Blah, blah, blah. It then tells us that we should add some arrows into our resources. And in order to do that, inside of Eclipse, I have the Big Nerd Ranch book. And then for the first app of GeoQuiz, inside the resources folder, inside of here, we got that guy. Where is it? GeoQuiz drawables directory. It looks like it has this in HDPI. No. Perhaps. Oh, I'm looking in the wrong place. Excuse me. In the resources file now, we should have, yes, the left and the right arrow. To add those in, all you do is you drag and drop basically. And we're going to put those inside the drawable HDPI. And it tells us that we should copy these, not link them. And what that means is that if we link them, then what would have to happen is that in order for the system to correctly find these files, it would have to have the exact same path every time. And if we're switching between computers, that's probably not going to be a true statement, so it's going to break the links. If instead we copy them, it's going to put them inside the actual folder here, and it's always going to be able to reference them. So that is the correct way to do it. And then it says that if you look at the r.java file and you look for arrow, you'll see that it creates a resource identifier to these two arrows that were just dropped in there. And then it says that if you are referencing this, then in the Android drawable, inside of your XML file, so here inside of the text view, or excuse me, not text view, should be button actually. The button for the next button, after we have this, we should go ahead and add in that reference to the drawable folder, and we tell it that we're looking for arrow right. It tells us that in order to support right and to left layouts, we should probably add some other stuff in here, but that's perfectly fine for now. The only other issue is that we have two hard-coded values right now, and what we could do is we could say add a new dimension, and its name could be button right padding, and that is set to 4dp. And now when we save that, that dimension is going to be updated. And then inside of our activity XML, we can reference that by saying @dimin/ and tell it that we want to use the right button padding. Likewise here for the text view padding, we could copy that, go here into dimensions, and add yet another dimension. And tell it this name will be text view padding and of 24dp. Save that. Now that's available to us. And then right here, we could say at dimin slash, test view, excuse me, text view padding, and now we need to update this reference because now it's broken. Save and run that. And so now we have removed these hard-coded values out of our code and put them into one dimensions resource. So what should happen now is that if I rerun the app, and assuming it doesn't hang, because sometimes it does when it loads it up, we now have this little next arrow there. Then we get a challenge, and the challenge is to add a previous button to this. And so the first thing to do to complete the challenge is to go here and to, well, we already have the arrow left, so that's going to be perfectly fine. So what we need to do instead is we'll just basically copy this, paste it on in there, and where we have a ID of next button, instead we're going to go into here and say that this ID is previous button. And right here we have at drawable arrow right and drawable right. We're going to set this to drawable left and arrow left. And just to see if that's actually running correctly thus far, we're going to go ahead and run our GeoQuiz. That kicks everything up. And now we have a next right and a next left. Now the layout is a bit broken. Wrap content, and that's probably because we're going to need to nest these two buttons inside a linear layout of type horizontal, and I'm just going to copy this and paste that right on in there, and then I need to close it out because it's going to be mad at me for not closing out my files, and yes, I am, and if all worked out as according to plan, when I run this again, and kick it up, I need to now update my text for the previous button because right now I'm still using this string called next button. So I'm going to need to just go ahead and copy this, and I'm going to call this previous button, and it's warning me that I have a conflict between two things with the same name, and that's not allowed. I have a previous button, and I'm going to set it equal to previous. Save that, go to run this again. And once it kicks it up, wait a minute. Previous button, is that what I set my string name to? The next button, ID previous button. No, I did not. Make sure, yep, it correctly links that. Okay. Now I'll run the configuration again. Oh, the joy. And now we have a next and a previous button. The only thing that sucks about it is their placement. So let's fix that very quickly. So we're just going to simply swap them out so that our previous button appears first and our next button appears last. And now, at least as far as the look of it goes, they should both look correct. So once again, last time, run this, or at least for this part of the testing, I'm going to be running it again a couple more times. And this is the advantage, yes, previous and next, and now it makes sense. Okay, so I've done some refactoring to the code, and basically what I've done is that I've set up the onTrue and onFalse button clicks to have the button definition right inside of it, just because it makes it cleaner and easier to read. And because these values do not need to be set prior to this class being called, so for example, this mQuestion text view is still there, still sitting around. And the reason why is that before set default question can be called, and I'll get to that in just a second, it must know what I'm referencing when I'm saying mQuestion text view. And I want to make sure that this is available to every single one of these methods. So in this case, it's okay to have it right here, even though I could refactor this out and put it somewhere else. But I think it's okay right there. Now, the next thing that I have is the onTrue button click and onFalse button click. What happens with the event handlers is that you have to specify when something should start listening for these event handlers. And usually do it on creation, because if you don't, then even though you have them defined, they're never called, so it's never listening for an event. So if you click on something and nothing is happening, it is most likely the case that your onCreate method is not actually calling the event listeners, so the events just aren't listened for. And then I have the next button and the previous button click. Now, I think this was called something different originally, and I've changed the name for it to be clear, and also because now I have a previous button, I need to be very specific about which one is being used at the moment. And then I said that I was very unhappy with the code because it told you to call the onNext method, the update next question method, and I thought that was bad because for debugging purposes, it puts you at this question by default, and if you have a lot of questions, maybe it's a bit confusing whenever you're trying to debug this of what was correct. At least it threw me off for a little bit. So now that I've set it to get the question at index 0, which is the starting point, it's going to set that text as the question. And so now my very first question is the question about the oceans, and I can say true, and that's correct. Then I click next, and I say false, and so forth and so on. And now it's a little easier for me to see where I'm starting off at and where I'm ending at. Now when I click the previous button, that handles it until I get an exception right there. Boom. So how do you know what happened? Why did it quit? Well, we go to logcat, and it's going to tell me why it quit. It's going to be this red error message. And usually whenever it starts off, like it starts from the most immediate thing that caused a problem down to the most specific. Anything that has Android or Java.lang, it is almost certainly our Dalvik, which is the Linux kernel that Android uses. These things are almost never going to throw problems. In fact, if they do throw a problem, you actually need to submit a bug for it. So whatever's going wrong is almost certainly because of you. So you start at the most specific or the most immediately invoked thing that caused a problem. And it says the problem is the java.lang array index out of bounds exception was thrown. And this makes very good sense to me, because what it is saying is that whenever I look at my code, and I'll double click this to pull it back down here, I'm telling it that in order to update my previous question, I'm basically doing the same thing in reverse, find out what the current index is, subtract 1 for it, and then get the modulus of the length. The problem is that if the index is 0 and I say -1, I am saying get me the array at position -1. And there is no -1 position in an array. That is an array out of bounds exception. So there are a few ways of dealing with this particular problem. So I will show you first the most typical Java approach to this problem. And Java is a heavy try, throw, catch language. And what that means is you try something, and then it calls the anything that is a subclass of throwable, and that'll throw an error of some sort. And then you catch that error and deal with it. And if you successfully deal with it, then Java is okay with it. If you do not successfully deal with it, then it crashes. So the first thing is you say throw, so throws, and it is array. Let me pull it down out of here. Blah, blah, blah. And it is throws array index out of bounds, and I misspelled it, bounds exception. So what this does is, and you can see what it does, When the array is indexed to value less than 0 or greater than or equal to the size of the array, it's out of bounds. And so we handled on the next button with this modulus check, and that ensures that it does not try to just add 1 to this without first making sure that it is not greater than the actual number of questions in here. So here we have protected ourselves from this particular error, but in this case we have not. So the first thing is we say that this can possibly throw an error, at least as it exists right now. So the first part of the statement is try, and then what we're going to do is we're going to indent this, and in addition to try, you must catch, and the thing we must catch is this array index out of bounds exception, and we'll call this E for the error message right there. And at this point we have actually satisfied the minimum requirements for this to work. So if I click run again and I say run configurations and I run it, next, okay. And now when I click previous, nothing is happening. And that's because in the specified array index out of bounds question, I'm not telling it to do anything. So it just sits there and does nothing. So the previous button does not react to it. So I've successfully caught the error and dealt with it. But to me, I'm not a huge fan of the try-catch sequence in any programming language, actually, even though Java makes a huge use of it, and you'll see it all over the place. I don't like it very much because it tends to create large amounts of indentation and a huge amount of catch blocks for catching all the possible error scenarios. My preferred solution is what was happening up here, where we simply have a check in place that ensures that the condition that throws the array's index out of bounds exception is never able to even occur. And I'll deal with that in just a bit. So the first way of handling this particular problem is to simply perform an if check that says if m's current index is greater than 0, then execute the following line of code. If it's not, don't do anything. So now, even though this does not throw an array index out of bounds exception, it has successfully caught it and it behaves the same. And I've done that with a lot less code, and I think that this is immediately obvious, whereas the other thing I know about try-catch blocks is that it's not immediately obvious which line is going to actually throw the exception. Whereas here, by preventing the exception from ever happening, it's immediately clear what the condition is there for. And that's the other reason I don't like try-catch blocks, is because they can become very long and it becomes difficult to understand which line is it that's problematic. And we know that it's this line right here. But now with this check in place, it's immediately obvious to other programmers what's going on right here. That's one way of dealing with it. Now, what we have not yet dealt with is UX, user interface experience, right? And we can see that it still works as long as the index is greater than 0. But once it hits that Pacific Ocean question again, it is now no longer able to execute. So that works from our standpoint. But it does not really work from a user standpoint because it appears as if something's kind of broken, right? If I click next and everything wraps around, that's fine. But if I click previous and suddenly it stops working, it's not really clear why this has stopped working. So I think that we should have some sort of visual indicator of when this thing is or is not working. All right, so in this next iteration of it, you can now see that the previous button behaves just like the next button does. And the way that we get that to work is that this modulus by the question bank.length, what that does is that when you call the .length property, it starts from 1. So if you ask the length of this array, it's going to say there are 5 elements in it, which is true. But remember that indexes start at 0, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So this modulus remainder is basically saying that it equals 1 plus, whatever the length is, which is going to be 5 in this particular case. So take whatever this is plus that and get the remainder from the length. Now, if we're tempted to use this, what I have done in my code is first say if the m current index is greater than 0, then do -1, get the modulus of that, and then set that as the question index. I could use an else statement here and say else, do this. But I prefer using multiple if statements. I prefer not using else because else's, just like the try catch blocks, and the reason why I don't like them is because they are not immediately obvious, particularly if you have a long if statement. It's not uncommon to have if statements that stretch for several dozen lines. It's not immediately obvious when you scroll down through the code what the else condition is actually checking. And if your else condition is only checking for one particular condition, then I just like to use the opposite of the if statement I am checking. So then I'm saying that if it's equal to 0, then the current index should be equal to the length minus 1, because if I don't have this typecast in place, I'm going to get this error, array index out of bounds exception. It's going to say the length is 5 and the index is 5, which means I'm trying to access one too many. So I subtract 1 to make sure that I am within bounds, and then I call the int question, and that enables me to successfully wrap around both forward and backward. Now, that's not the only solution to the challenge, but it is my solution to it, and that is also to ensure that I have a common set of behavior between the different components. Because before, where I just didn't do anything, it could appear broken or otherwise strange to a user to have that behavior if it's unexpected. So now I have a consistent behavior whether you click the next button or the other button. And I think I covered this guy, the set default question, but all that does is it makes sure the first question set is starting off at current index of 0. And in fact, I could actually just pass in the current index because it starts off by default at 0. It's already been both declared and initialized with the value. So I could actually put that in right there, and that would also work just fine. But for simplicity's sake, I'm simply hard coding the 0 in there because I know that I always want it to start off at 0.